many of you got to see Peter speak when we had him here traipsing about Northern Ontario. I guess it's 2 years ago now, Peter. We've been keeping in touch with Peter, talking to him about leadership and the challenges in small and rural municipalities coming out of COVID. And Peter was very amenable to the idea of participating in our webinar. So we're just absolutely thrilled to have him here today. The format for our webinar today is going to be a little bit different than we usually do, in that I'm going to hand over the floor to Peter, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what's going on in Australia and give us his ideas of leadership for councils and staff coming out of this COVID crisis. And then he's willing to take questions from the group. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will read those out to Peter as when he finishes his main presentation. So I just want to say thanks very much, Peter, for joining us. I know it's after 10 o'clock your time at night. It's the morning for us, and we're really excited to hear what you have to say. So I guess before I let Peter talk, what I want to tell you about as well is that this is a bit of a teaser or introduction for a webinar that we're going to put on in conjunction with E4M on October the 23rd, and mark that in your calendars because we're going to have a half-day webinar with Peter Kenyon and George Cuff. You've never seen a webinar like this before. It's going to be amazing. Because it's going to be done on Zoom, there's a limited number of people that can attend. So if you're interested, please email either Brittany Hodgkinson or Peggy Young-Lovelace at E4M so that we can get you registered and we can secure your place to hear Peter and George talk. We're really thrilled about that one. So Peter, again, thank you. I'm going to hand the floor over to you, and please start sending in the questions, and we'll have a great seminar with Peter this morning. Thanks very much, Peter. Over to you.
Right. Look, thank you, Paul, and greetings everyone all the way from the little community called Kalamunda, which means home in the forest, which is in Western Australia. I want to thank Paul and the team for the opportunity to participate. My memories of spending time in Northern Ontario, which is now probably about 18 months ago, are still so fresh, and I certainly just love my time. I always love my time in Canada. We kind of like share so much in common, and particularly in Northern Ontario. I'm very much a small towns boy. I'm out of a very remote part of the north of our state, mining, and had a lot in common with what I saw in Northern Ontario, and it's just good to be with you. It is about 10 o'clock in the evening, and it's Friday night here. It's been a full-on week for me here, so I'm not quite sure what you'll actually get tonight, but it's the end of a long week and a long day. But look, it is great to just be actually with you. I thought I'd just use a few slides in terms of it, and hopefully these will be of use to you. But look, the kick-off though, can I very much really identify with all of you who happen to come from a small town. I love this quote: the nice thing about living in a small town is when you don't know what you're doing, someone else does. And I'm sure all of us who are involved in small town life will kind of like appreciate that. I'd love to just share with you where I come from, and I was there for a whole week only a week ago. It's a little town called Marble Bar, population about 240, an old gold mining town. But it actually does have the record of being the hottest town in Australia. Back in 1931-32, the temperature went over 100 degrees for 167 consecutive days. So it's why it is called the hottest town. And the community today has reinvented itself as a tourism destination, as one of our best remote outback towns. And that's what they've really kind of like built upon. I love when I was there the other day, you know, it was 36.5 degrees. And I love, though, the sign outside the pub, outside 47, inside 26, beer, kind of like -2. And it's one of those kind of like outback kind of like communities that really play upon that. And I just love kind of like being back in terms of that place. It's famous for one thing, and that is the Marble Bar Cup, which is held, and the very last race is called the Undies race, where the entire community run around the track in their undies. So that's very Australian and very much part of what it was all about. 3 years ago, though, and this race has gone on for about 40 years, it was called the nude race, where everyone ran naked until the local police closed that down and we became civilised, and now it's got to be done in kind of like undies. But that's what the town is very much famous for, and very much as part of where we're actually at. Can I say the one thing we all do share at the present time is this thing called COVID-19, and certainly like Canada, Australia has been hit by it. Can I say here in Western Australia, probably not as bad as the other states. We haven't had a community transmission case now since April. Our borders have been closed, though, to the other states, and it's likely to remain like that till March of next year. So almost 12 months we will have been isolated from the rest of the country. We're already the most isolated state, and that's obviously had a huge impact on many of our communities, and particularly communities dependent upon tourism, hospitality, the people type industry. We have seen, you know, zero international tourism and zero interstate tourism coming in, and obviously we now are sitting around about a 12% unemployment rate, and certainly the impact on many of our small businesses has been absolutely devastating. We did go through a time of lockdown when we were in our homes, and many of us had to start working from home. And I love this particular picture of the reality for many people trying to cope with working from home and running homeschooling and coping with the kids and whatever. There's been a lot of humour here in Australia with COVID, and I think that's one of the things we've always got to remember. You know, we've got to keep smiling, and we've got to keep finding some of the positives and so on. And certainly, I think all of us are just aware around the globe of just some of the stunning stories. And I think one of the things that I certainly think is one of the great silver linings in terms of this whole COVID experience is that while many of our services have kind of like collapsed and our programs were not possible, and many of our agencies, and particularly those out of service land, had to kind of like close up shop, what has worked is this thing called community, where suddenly neighbours been supporting neighbours. Suddenly the most amazing examples of kind of like people starting to come together. I'm sure we're all were inspired by that 99-year-old who was about to turn 100, who decided to raise money for the National Health System in the UK, and he walked around his yard 100 times and in the process raised £57 million and whatever. I think those stories just abound. Or that guy who suddenly found he no longer had a job working in the Seattle Opera Company, but then every afternoon would come out in his street and put on a neighbourhood opera in his front yard, and hundreds of neighbours would gather every Friday afternoon, every day, to hear him put on his 30-minute concert. There's just been this story after story of how neighbour has supported neighbour, and how this thing called community has actually been rebirthed in many ways, and certainly in many of our towns, and certainly in many of our neighbourhoods. And to me, that's been one of the most exciting things that's come out of COVID, the way that people have just stepped up to support each other. And I hope that one of the things that we're going to learn out of COVID is let's not lose this. One of the themes, and we're about to have a major conference called Power of the People Conference. The theme of it is let's not waste a good crisis, because the one thing that has worked has been this thing called community. And certainly here, those local governments and other organisations that have recognised that and realised that, you know what, we're not going to go back to the so-called normal back around November, December 2019. There's a new kind of like norm that we're going to get used to. And one of the things that we don't want to go back to is the way that we closed down community, the way we did things to and for people. And I think one of the things we've learned is that we've got to keep opening space now of and by the people. And to me, I think that's a critical role that local government's got to play. We are not going to go back to the old world, and the new world needs to be one where local governments see their role not to service community, but to strengthen community and to create and to open doors and windows to allow kind of like this type of community type of behaviours to kind of like start happening. To me, I think there's been three critical lessons that we've learned in Australia. And the first is the one I've already mentioned, and that is that it's really got people, it's given people a breather to think about what matters personally, what matters in our family lives, what is it we really value, but also this thing, what do we really matter about how we create strong communities. And I love this Dave Hollis quote, in the rush to return to normal, use this time to consider which parts of normal are worth rushing back to. And to me, I think it's absolutely vital that we do use this time to reflect on what is it that we want to go back to, particularly in terms of community life. And I think particularly local governments have a critical role to play in terms of really taking and retaining the things that have actually worked. And certainly here in Australia, this thing called community solidarity, neighbour support, neighbour supporting neighbour. How do we make sure we don't actually lose some of that stuff? Some of you will know this guy, a US guy who does a lot of work in small town USA, Quinn Stutter, who put it very well when he said, don't expect the reboot to put your community right back to where it was before COVID. For starters, it's not possible. I've read and heard this many times and agree. When this is over, the world will have changed in many ways. But also, even if we could, we shouldn't settle for a return to the old normal. We owe it to the community to aim higher. And really, in most of our communities, local government's got a critical leadership role to kind of like play in all of this. The thing too that's we've also been really focused on is that COVID has been devastating. None of us saw it coming. None of us wanted it. None of us even know when it's going to end. But you know what? There have been silver linings, and there have been some incredible opportunities we've found in many of our rural communities. For example, many of our young people have considered kind of like returning back to their homes. If people are going to be shut down somewhere, why not go back to where I remember kind of like a great childhood? Many people have made the decision to move out of our cities back into regional and rural kind of like areas. Tourism, because of all of our borders have been closed, is booming in all of our kind of like rural areas, and it's thrown up a whole pile of new entrepreneurial opportunities. And many of our local governments are saying, how do we create that supportive ecosystem to foster this environment for many of our young people to return back to rural communities, not just for a short period, but for kind of like the long run? And how do we help them to kind of like foster and start up and develop entrepreneurial kind of like activities? I think that old quote of Albert Einstein is just so important. In the midst of every crisis lies opportunity. Let's not pretend that things will change if we keep doing the same things. And I suppose the challenge I've been saying to my own local government, and now to a whole pile of local governments I'm working with now across WA, is listen, don't waste a good crisis. Realise this has given us an opportunity to kind of like discover new ways of doing things. Don't try to just go back to where you were. And the role of local government, I hope, will not be the same. I hope we'll move from that old servicing kind of like role that most local governments seem to have got themselves caught up to going back to what really matters. And that's not how we service community, but how we strengthen this thing called community. Certainly, the other lesson that we've really learned that I've reiterated is that whatever the issue, community's been the answer. I mean, it's been amazing, so many of our state government and local government agencies and our NGOs, many of them just closed up shop. They can't deliver the old programs and services like they used to. But you know what? This thing called community has actually come alive. And to me, it's really demonstrated that old kind of like saying, whatever the issue, community is kind of like the answer. And so I really hope that one of the great things that we'll learn is how do we kind of like foster this and how do we kind of like strengthen it? A guy that I know has had a big impact on rural Canada, as he has in rural Australia, has been this guy Ernesto Ciroli, and he put it very well when he said the future of every community lies in capturing the passion, the imagination and resources of its people. And I suppose what we've been really encouraging during this time is saying to leaders, and particularly civic leaders in our rural communities, you know, now's the time to be really mapping those assets, beginning to identify kind of like the amazing talent that we have in our communities, and how do we start connecting that talent in interesting ways. We've seen an amazing amount of asset mapping kind of like going on during this time. It's again given us the chance to do those things. And it's began to get people recognizing we just have kind of like so many really amazing things. I think what we've seen over the last 40 years is the contraction of this thing called community and the growth of this thing called service land. And it hasn't built strong communities. It's turned people into recipients of what other people are going to do to and for them. And I think what COVID has really shown is that people can actually take control of their streets, their neighbourhoods, their towns, and really start making great contributions. I love this quote that most of our communities are a bit like an ice hockey game where 20,000 people need the exercise, turn up to watch 12 players who don't. And it seems to me we've got to move away from that whole model of where we treat people in community as recipients. You know, here in Australia, local governments have now called people kind of like customers. The health department now refers to people as consumers. NGOs call them clients. Well, you know what? We don't need consumers or customers. We need kind of like contributors. We need organisers of what's going on in community. We actually need citizens, not clients. And so COVID has really demonstrated in many ways how this can happen. And I think the smart local governments are beginning to recognise, you know what, let's not go back into some of the old modes that we've known. Let's begin to foster and strengthen this thing called community. And really our role is to kind of like strengthen community, not just try to service it in many ways. And I suppose the final lesson that we've really learned is the importance of local leadership. One of the activities I've been involved in with a group called Rural Aid across Australia is we've been running weekly webinars for about 500 community builders across rural Australia. And it's been really interesting as we've really focused on what builds a strong town. This thing called leadership and the type of behaviours that are associated with strong leadership have really come out in terms of being at the heart of it. And we've now run about 20 of these webinars on a weekly basis around this theme, what builds a great kind of like town. It's been a great time for people to take time out to begin to really look at this stuff in a fresh way. And I suppose these are the four themes that we've really tried to kind of like develop here and share. And we've just had amazing stories across the country of how rural communities are kind of like stepping up in these areas. How do we develop what we call proactive and shared leadership in our communities? The importance of that thing called positive mindset. What are the practices that need to go on in a town that builds a strong town in terms of things like collaboration and partnership, how we engage people, how do we turn people from being recipients into kind of like co-players, co-designers of what's going on in their community. And then finally, what are those things we can do to kind of like reinvent and re-strengthen and in many ways redirect where our local economy's at? What are those things at the town level that we can really do to start fostering a strong economy? Because we know a strong economy, a strong community are the two sides of the same coin. But at the heart of all this stuff has been this thing called leadership. And even going back 25 years, our national government did a major study on why certain towns and regions were going ahead and others were going back. And at the end of the day, after spending $1 million doing the study, they came out with this one quote. And I think this one quote really summarised it so well, that really at the heart of strong communities is strong leadership. And yet we don't often invest in it. You know, we just somehow hope it happens, or we assume that because people have a certain position within a town, then they're suddenly the leader. Well, what we have learnt and what we've really started to do during all these COVID times is invest in this thing kind of like called leadership. What is it? Well, I love that kind of like definition of George Patton and so on, and many people are at that level. But you know what, to me, I think what we've began to realise during this time in COVID, there really are 6 critical things that I think we need to be doing. One of them is simply making things happen. You know, leaders get on with it. Leaders kind of like do implement things. And although we've been in lockdown, it's just been amazing to see some towns have and some haven't. You know, people have kind of like got out there and have recognised, yes, we have a crisis. But, you know, as the Chinese write, you know, crisis is made up of 2 words, danger and opportunity. And people have actually, in many of our communities, have started to focus on what are the new opportunities that COVID have actually done. And we've seen amazing stuff happening in terms of rural reinvention. We've seen things happening in the tourism sector. We've certainly seen, as I said, that whole fostering of young people returning back, helping to contribute to a new economy in many of these towns. And at the heart of it has kind of like been leaders that have actually done it. I think the other thing that we have really pushed is at this time, we need people who are talking up and not talking down. People are really going through incredible fatigue, and people are down in many ways. And what we really need are leaders who are got that capacity to kind of like inspire people to say, you know what, we don't know how long the tunnel is. There is some light at the end, but you know what? Out of this, we're going to come out stronger, and have actually focused on providing that mindset that have enabled leaders to kind of like cope, and for whole communities to kind of like cope. And we've seen that across the globe. I mean, you know, the international media obviously focus on the US, and you can really see where in certain states and certain rural areas and communities, leadership have kind of like stepped up, and way that they have coped has just been so different to kind of like other people and so on. But again, as I said, this we've considered that whole mindset, that attitudinal thing being so important. I think the other thing that we've really recognised is that, you know, the role of leadership is to kind of like open doors and windows for people to do things. And now's not the time to go into compliance. Now is not the time to be closing down. Now is the time, I think, to be kind of like investing in opportunity and encouraging people to kind of like think outside the box. In fact, this is a time to get rid of the box. This is a time to think out. And I think it'll be incredibly sad that that all we do is kind of like somehow close down and go into a tighter kind of like fiscal kind of like mindset and whatever. It seems at the present time, those communities are recognizing, you know what, in terms of the future, now is the time to invest. It's like, you know, when we are in recession and businesses, it's those businesses that don't suddenly realize, well, we're in recession, we're going to cut expenditure, we're going to kind of like cut back. You know, that's the time to think new. That's the time to kind of like invest in fresh marketing. That's the time to think in terms of how do we as a business do things smarter, rather than say the answer is to kind of like contract and whatever. And I found the same has actually happened in our towns. The fourth thing that we've learned is, look, in terms of the future, it's got to be about collaboration. It's got to be about people starting to hold hands. Not one group in the community are going to be able to rebirth our communities in creative ways. And what we're beginning to discover here, again, is the strong communities are places which leadership, particularly civic leadership, is investing in building collaborative kind of like approaches, collective impact type strategies, beginning to recognise now's the time to come together. And let me say, the one thing we've learned about our collective impact models here is that for the first time, community is sitting at the table. It's no longer all about service land, kind of like deciding what's happening. The one thing that did work was community, and community leaders are kind of like stepping up and becoming kind of like part of the whole thing. The fifth thing that, again, that we've really discovered is that whole thing about, as I mentioned, the thing about fostering positive mindset. I love this particular Snoopy cartoon. You know, someday we'll all die, Snoopy. True, but on all the other days we'll not. And if there's a time that we need leaders to kind of get people talking up and beginning to think in new and creative ways, that's why we're using expressions now like, let's not waste a good crisis. We have been given kind of like a new set of cards in the pack. How do we kind of like play those in kind of like creative ways? And certainly we're finding this whole thing about mindset and creativity has become a really important thing. I love that quote out of Heartland. You know, you can't move your town to a different location. You can move your town's attitude in a different direction. And if there's a time now that that's needed, is right now. One of the communities that's inspired us out in this part of the world has been Christchurch, who 10 years ago had that massive kind of like earthquake. It also had that horrific massacre that happened in several of their mosques and whatever. But as one looks at that little country called New Zealand, and we look particularly at the leadership in a place like Christchurch, they have really inspired us in many ways. And at our Power to the People conference in a month's time, we're certainly going to have as one of our presenters an interesting woman who has overseen a lot of that, and it's a woman called Vicky Buck, who was very much the former leader, but has been instrumental in both in local government and in the community to get people thinking up. Her whole thing is she's been giving out giraffe awards for people who've been prepared to stick out their neck and kind of like have a go and make things happen. And I love one of the quotes that she often used, and that is, I think negative people should be taxed. They require an incredible amount of energy. They're like corgis nibbling at your ankles. And I'm sure they exist to show us the difference between heaven and hell. And one of the things that she has done is said, at the heart of true leadership is actually people who can get people talking up and not talking down. And particularly at the present time when this thing's gone on so long and so many people have been caught up in varying stages of lockdown and the fatigues there, boy, do we need people who are just inspiring us to kind of like think and whatever. One of her other great statements is this: when facing a difficult task, act as if it's impossible, fail. When going after Moby Dick, bring along the tartare sauce. And it just seems to me that that's the type of mindset that we needed. And the final thing that, you know, is happening in this time is this is a great time to kind of like build leadership. And, you know, using the type of technology and using webinar and the whole, this is a time that we can grow leadership. And I think the innovative local government's one that's already putting in place stuff that's about growing the leadership within community. Leaders create leaders who create leaders. And I think the whole model of kind of like believing that, you know, we have a set of people there who are the leaders and those are the fault. No. What we need to do is to expand and make much more inclusive and grow that kind of like leadership base. And you know what, COVID-19 has given us an amazing time to kind of like get people thinking outside the box, thinking and developing their personal and their community development type skills. And again, it's great to see certain local governments have really taken this as a time to kind of like really do that. So just to close, can I just leave you my favorite quote about COVID? It is a time. We all know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. We just don't know how long that tunnel is. And I just look forward to a time when we can begin to move out of our state, begin to move outside our boundaries again, and particularly our national borders and whatever. But you know what, this is a time to be kind of like thinking in positive ways, and the role particularly of local governments are just absolutely essential. But my starting point is we are not going back to what we knew back there in November, December. We need to rip up all of those strategic plans that were written in 2019, and we need to kind of like begin to see it is a new world that's being birthed. And yes, there is huge challenges with that, particularly in terms of how we the resources needed and the unemployment levels that we face and the loss of businesses, the mental health issues. We know all of those things are there, but also there are a whole pile of silver linings that are providing us a whole pile of opportunities. So that's my kind of like homily sermon for the night. It's not even Sunday, but that's where we're at in terms of rural, kind of like Western Australia at the present time. And I'm just excited to see things that are starting to happen and flourish, and there are green shoots starting to happen across the landscape. And to me, that's very exciting. So let me leave it there, Paul, and perhaps throw it open to any questions or comments or debate that people want to engage in.
All right. Well, I've got a ton of questions already for you, Peter. So one of the things that you talk about, and I've heard you mention it before, and I'd like you to expand on it a little bit, is the idea of asset mapping. So I just want you to tell us, what it is and how do you do it?
Yeah, look, asset mapping is initially what it actually implies. It's going out there and starting to identify all of those great assets that we actually have. The only difference is that it's not an audit. It is not about counting. It's not about listing. It is about finding connection between those assets and beginning to mobilize those connected assets. And that, to me, is the exciting bit. It's about undertaking some form of mapping exercise, but it is about then starting to find the connection between the dots. We tend to here map 6 types of assets, and obviously the most important asset that we always map is the people assets, discovering people's interests, people's backgrounds, people's work experiences. But probably the most critical asset we're starting now to map is what people care about. That question, what is it you care about? Because that's their motivation to act. Now, there's all of that, what we call the people type assets. Then within all of our communities are all the networks and groups and associations. I belong to a number of organisations. I'm part of a faith community. I also happen to go. I've got a Saturday morning riding group, which is really an excuse for a drinking group. It doesn't have a constitution, but it's a powerful kind of like group of people. We all have it. I'm doing the community plan currently for one little country town that's got 800 people in it, and we've discovered 93 organisations for a town of 800. They all have to be on at least 7 committees to keep it all going. But you know what? That's kind of like that organisational asset. Then there are all those institutional assets, and obviously local government's the classic one, but there's usually a school, there's a hospital, there's a police station, there's a whole pile of service and NGO groups that come in and out of the town as the White Toyota Cavalry here in Australia. They're all assets that we need to be aware of and what they're doing. I'm working on a suicide strategy in a town of 450 people. And the other day I had 25 service providers around the table who are all contributing something to preventing suicide in a town of 450 people. What I found amazing is not one of them knew what each other's were doing. They were all operating within little silos. And so to start an asset map amongst them to discover what each of them were contributing or had the capacity to contribute. So those are the institutional ones. Then you've got the business assets. That's obvious, the businesses in the main street, but then there's all those backyard businesses. There's all those informal trading, kind of like things that go on in terms of swap meets and all of that type of stuff. And again, how do we kind of like do those? Then we've got all of our physical assets. Every town has both natural and built kind of like assets, again, mapping all of them. And then finally, every town has cultural assets, Indigenous, non-Indigenous heritage. Every town has stories, and stories are incredible assets if we're wanting to kind of like look to a future and what we can actually build around and those type of things. So they're the 6 forms of assets. And so the starting point is getting people into a creative process of starting to map all of that. And there are a whole heap of tools, and I can certainly, Paul, send through to you a handbook that we put together during this COVID time to get people into asset mapping. We've been doing a lot of workshops in that area, and I'd be more than happy to send you through our handbook, which you can circulate to everyone if they free. It's a free handbook that we've produced. But as I said, the critical thing about asset mapping is not about counting. It's about connecting.
The chat's lit up, Peter. Lots of people saying, "Yep, we would like that handbook." So I would love it if you would send that, and we'll certainly share it about. So Lots of questions here. One of the realities that we're facing, Peter, is people are scared. People in our communities are afraid, and that seems to be translating to a negative, detailed focus, often from ratepayers, about what municipal councils are doing wrong, and municipal staff as well. And what we're seeing is sometimes one or two people, sometimes groups of people, spending a lot of time and taking a lot of leadership time and focus, criticizing municipalities about what they're doing wrong, criticizing staff about what they're doing wrong. How do you see, or what thoughts do you have about dealing with that issue or fixing that issue?
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question, and obviously varies from place to place. But you know, the starting point, yes, people are scared, and that fear that people have had is expressed in many ways. I mean, initially here, we had particularly people from other states were kind of like often physically abused or verbally abused, backpackers from other countries. You know, when people are uncertain, and we've never known this thing in our generation, this thing called COVID is just new and unique for our whole generation. We've never gone through anything like this. You know, I'm sure people who went through the Great Depression and so on had a sense of it, but our generation, and it has often brought out the worst in people. And if there's a time for leadership to kind of like step up and not feed that type of stuff. I mean, again, we only have to look south of your borders to see people who just feed that stuff, and the long-term damage that stuff does in terms of separating people and polarizing people and whatever. And it's become, I think, a political tactic as much as anything now. And I think that's been something that we've got to kind of like fight against. So we really need leaders who call out that type of behavior. And secondly, began really getting people, as I said earlier, beginning to talk up, not kind of like talk down in terms of where it's at. We have seen particularly people have become a lot more verbally abusive of people behind the counter, and particularly at local government levels. But, you know, again, in supermarkets, when everyone just went crazy and bought toilet rolls and nappies, and we led to all of that stuff, and the way that staff were being abused, you know, I mean, here in Australia, we had just before COVID had gone through a massive wildfire time where we had massive kind of like bushfires raging in every state of Australia. It was just horrific. And you know what? It brought out the best in people. People were donating. People were looking at how we support these devastated communities. And within weeks, we went into COVID, and almost the opposite behaviour started to happen, where people started to hoard, where people started to push each other over, where people started to kind of like attack each other. And I suppose what I really admired was that is when we needed leaders to stand up and become effective in that. So that's the first thing. Leadership matters in all of that, getting people to kind of like think up, not kind of like think down. I think the second thing is that we are in that position. And can I say, a lot of local governments have set themselves up for that. I mean, I don't know what you call them in Australia, in Canada, I can't remember, but in Australia, we now refer to people as customers in local government. We have set up service centres to service customer kind of like complaints and all of this stuff. Now, if I'm told I'm a customer, I immediately have a whole pile of expectations. I pay my rates. You should be doing this. You should be doing that. And I say to local government, whoever invented that should be strung up. That was the craziest thing to ever do, because what you've simply done is to create a mindset that I am a recipient because I pay my rates and you should be doing these things. And so one of the things I've been saying, particularly to my own local governments I'm part of, is look, this is a time to birth citizenship. This is a time for you to stop pushing this, we are there to service community. You're there to strengthen community, and we need to use this time to start doing that. So that's the second thing. We've actually set ourselves up often for kind of like that type of response, because that's the role that we've taken on. You often say to people, what's the purpose of local government? And they say, to serve community. I say, no, it's not. It's to strengthen community. Have a look at your mission statements. Creating healthy, connective, inclusive, engaged community is often the mission. But that's not how you act. You act as a service provider. And so how do we kind of like move into that in terms of the long thing is really important. And I think the third thing is that we've got to really engage people and get people believing together we can kind of like confront this kind of like crisis that we're facing. I have a beach batch place in a regional town called Mandurah. It's about 95,000 people. It's about an hour south of Perth. It's a beautiful beach area and whatever. But there's an amazing young mayor. He's the youngest mayor in Australia. His name's Rhys Williams. He's a 31-year-old who got elected as the mayor. And I have just been amazed at how he and his leadership, as soon as this whole crisis hit, he was faced. They had a major event that was planned called the Crab Festival. It's the home of the Blue Manna crab and whatever. They attract 100,000 visitors to this, and 3 days out he had to cancel the festival. Well, you can imagine the absolute devastation to local businesses that had invested tens of thousands of dollars into this massive thing. But with state closing, the chief medical officer saying, look, you just cannot bring large groups of people together. He had to do that. Now, that's probably the hardest decision of his entire life. He came out with incredible criticism, you can imagine, from people who'd invested trillions in kind of like into this whole thing. But we know it was the right decision at the time, because that's a community that's really coped incredibly well with containing kind of like the virus. But, you know, immediately what Rhys then did was to actually engage everyone. So he brought together all of the neighbourhood associations, and he met with them on a weekly basis through kind of like Zooming people. He brought together all the church ministers every week. He brought together whole piles of people on a regular basis saying, how are we, the community, going to kind of like cope with all of this? And it seems to me that's the type of leadership that I'm talking about. The old leadership of local government, we know best, we are there, we run this community, that's over. And what we need is kind of like a new model where how are we together going to kind of like build a new community out of what we've seen. And the starting point for that is to engage community and bring people together. And we've now got, you know, COVID has taught us how to use technology to bring together large groups of people in ways that we can't. You know, I'm aware in some of our churches, for example, they're getting 1,000 people listening, clicking into some of their services, where in the pre-COVID time, they're getting 100 people. But, you know, through new technology and people doing it from their lounge room and creating things like Messy Church and all this stuff, wow, it's just been quite exciting. And I suppose what Rhys has done is actually done that across the city. And he has regularly just brought people together and made people feel part of kind of like confronting this thing, but above all, creating a new world, a new future. And I think that's the type of leadership that I particularly kind of like want to see. And I just don't believe in places like Mandurah they'll ever go back to the old model. They're already talking about, you know what, our budgets mean we're just not going to be able to deliver all those services we used to. But you know what? Maybe we shouldn't have been delivering and being in service delivery in that way. Maybe we need to find smarter ways of how we actually engage other people to begin to do it, and how we become a partner with other people. So new partnerships are starting to happen. There's certainly been a whole movement of their community development staff into place-based approaches, as opposed to the silo approach that we've always known, operating from City Hall, and people have been now diverted, and we've known through people now being based back in their homes, in their neighbourhoods, new ways of actually doing things is actually happening. And I think that is part of it as well. Local government have got to be seen not to being reactive, but being very much proactive in the whole thing. But ultimately, we can't afford staff to be abused. We've got to always contain that, and we've got to call that type of behaviour out. We've got to call out the type of fear-mongering and the way that certain minorities have actually been kind of like attacked in all this because people are scared and people are afraid and people don't know. Well, you know what? It takes leadership also to make sure that kind of like doesn't happen, and that we actually foster the caring stuff. We've got to highlight best practice. We've got to talk up the community heroes who have done amazing things. We've got to start producing now those cute little stories and YouTubes about how community have responded incredibly positively. We've got to get on the front page of our press, you know, that whole approach that if it bleeds, it leads type stuff. You know, I mean, I just don't watch the news any longer in terms of COVID because, you know, you slit your wrists if you kind of like sat there night after night hearing it. What we've got to do is replace that with kind of like some of the incredible positives and some of the great community hero stuff that's actually happened. So, yeah, look, we've got to be very proactive in how we do it, and we've got to operate on lots of different fronts.
So I'm going to build on that with another question that's come in, and I want you to know, Peter, that on this presentation we got a whole bunch of community heroes here, and what I want you to tell me about is how has the traditional view of leadership changed during the pandemic? You know, we always see the councillors and the mayor as the leader, but in your mind, has the definition of leadership changed? Is frontline staff responsible for leading communities? Is it just the politicians? Who are the leaders that you're speaking about here?
Yeah, look, you know, one of the things, and you saw it in terms of the 4 building blocks that we've been running webinars on what builds a strong town, has been this concept of diversified leadership. And to me, I think we've got to move away from some of the traditional models, i.e. that kind of like civic and high profile business people are the natural key leaders within community. You know, there's a whole pile of leadership out there that we've actually got to foster and we've got to elevate and recognise. Here in Australia now, we do talk about there's those formal leaders. And if you ask someone in a typical Australian small town, who are your leaders? You can almost guarantee 3 things will happen. Firstly, over 70% of the names you'll be given will be men. Secondly, over 70% of the names you'll be given will be in the 50 to 70 age group. And thirdly, most of the names you'll be given are people who we ascribe leadership to because of their position. They are the mayor, they are a councillor, they are the general manager of the council, they are the school principal, they are the bank manager, they are from a well-known local family. It's all positional leadership. Ask a different question. Who makes things happen in your community? And you know what? I find 70% of the names are given to women. I find that 70% of the names happen to be in that 35 to 50 age group. And I tend to find that most of those people do it out of passion, not out of position. We tend to refer them often as community builders, but you know what? They're pretty powerful leaders in the place. And it just seems to me we've got to broaden our understanding of how people contribute leadership. I'm one of those people that believes everyone can be a leader. Everyone has some special gift. Everyone cares about something. How do we actually create opportunities for people to kind of like step up? Secondly, how do we break down the traditional barriers? This whole idea that local government knows best, local government happens to run communities. You know, we have a term here, it's called crap. It's a crappy concept. What we got to begin to recognise is the best leadership is a set of kind of like people across community who are holding hands. Yes, civic leaders. Yes, people out of business and industry leaders. Yes, people out of education. Yes, people out of our different associations. Yes, kind of like our young people who are stepping up doing certain things. How do we kind of like begin to foster a partnership and a much more let's begin to hold hands together kind of like approach, rather than assuming that leadership is in the hands of kind of like the few. I think one of the things that COVID has done is actually show people that there is a whole pile of others. You know, it's often the most unassuming people that have stepped up in this crisis that have inspired people. I look at that 99-year-old who walks around his house 100 times and whatever, you know, he got motivated by a granddaughter who said, you know, you can do something, granddad, you know, you can use your walking frame and do it. And he actually blows people apart. Well, you know what? There are just so many great stories of that. And in my own community, a group of us found a young guy who produces brilliant YouTube. So we got him out there just capturing all these stories. And we're now pushing that out through all our media and our local radio station and whatever about inspiring stories of where people stepped up. And many of them are not people that you would traditionally call a leader in the town, but they've actually inspired people when most people have been pretty down. And it just seems to me, what a great role also for local government. What a great role for local government to be identifying local heroes who have done amazing things. So, you know, we've had cases of people who, without even saying, have just gone out and helped half a dozen neighbours who just haven't been able to have no kind of like family or support networks or whatever, but have just kind of like gone out there and done those type of things. Well, how do we highlight that type of leadership so that more people kind of like do these type of things? And it seems to me the capturing of case studies, capturing of stories, the broadcasting of that, beginning to say that's the new norm that we want to kind of like create. And it seems to me that's a critical role that local government can play. Less direct service delivery, more about strengthening community, of which strengthening and growing leadership has to be a most critical role within community. I mentioned earlier that all of our studies show that the most critical aspect of building a strong community is leadership. But how many local governments have a budget for called leadership development? How many communities actually have a leadership development strategy? Yeah, sure, they have a staff development strategy. Sure, they have often a bit of a program for a select number, but a comprehensive strategy for growing citizenship, for growing leadership, engaging kids as young as 6, 7, and 8 in doing amazing things in their community. That's the type of new roles that I'm really encouraging our local governments to think about. I say to every local government I meet, show me your community leadership development strategy. Tell me how much money are you spending? What's the budget line for community leadership development? You've got a budget for pavements and footpaths, but you don't have one for leadership. Boy, what world do you live in? It just seems to me this is a time to think new and think smart, and above all, recognise let's not waste a good crisis. This crisis has given us a time to reflect personally and as a community, and we've got to really work on that.
So many questions, Peter. Bit of a negative question. So one of the things that we are seeing, and we're certainly blaming it on our 20 to 30 somethings, is groups of people that are getting together, flouting the precautions. Nuala has spoken a fair bit about compliance fatigue. How do we deal with that health crisis, but at the same time stay positive so that we're not turning our community against these people?
Yeah, I mean, that is a difficult one because, and that's been happening, and not so much here in my state, but certainly in the state of Victoria, which has gone into a second wave like many places have, and it's been really tough for people. And so we've got these groups now who are protesting that and are actually just going out of their way to demonstrate their so-called liberties have been impinged upon, and particularly when you've also got world leaders that are advocating that type of stuff for their own political gain. Not a good time, because in many ways that type of behaviour is just kind of like, in many ways, selfish behaviour. We have certainly had some of our political leaders really call that stuff out, and we've had a lot of community leaders. And I think that's needed. If we're going to fight this stuff, obviously how we social distance and how we together kind of like make all this stuff actually happen. If you want to see, I think probably the best demonstration of that anywhere on the globe has been the leadership of the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Ahern. She has just been amazing how she has particularly got a whole nation and communities kind of like beginning to say, you know, together we've got to do the right thing. Together we're actually going to just kind of like achieve that. And I think that is a critical role for leadership at the present time. I don't think also we need to give, you know, we shouldn't be giving these people the type of news airspace that the media wants to. You know, I think we need to be talking up the positive stuff that people are doing to support each other, and again, how we kind of like comment on that type of stuff. To me, it's a very difficult one. I'm one of those people that tends to find, you know, I think that's deviant behaviour that's quite destructive. And I'm probably one of those people that prefers to kind of like call that stuff out. It's selfish behaviour, and it is not kind of like helping. I know it's tough. And I think the other thing we got to do is to recognise that this fatigue is in there. And again, how do we actually get around that? How do we, with all the technology and all the ways, start to lighten the load for people, and above all, keep people socially connected? How do we actually do that in creative ways? So it's the other side of the coin that we've also got to make sure we're actually focused on. Because the longer this goes on, the more we're going to see more and more of that type of stuff. And I suspect, again, because of the focus on that place south of your border, and as they move into a presidential election, where, you know, one side are going to obviously push some of that type of stuff for political reasons, it's entering into people's conversations here. How do we change the conversation? Not really a practical answer to your question, Paul, but I think it's an important one that requires people to sit down and have a conversation about how we're going to do that within our community. And I suppose that's the other thing that I've really have loved during this time, is this time has given us a time for quality conversations. And it's often out of these conversations that great ideas are birthed. And again, that's one of the topics that we just need to float and get that into the public domain, get people talking about how do we kind of like cope better together, and how do we prevent that type of behavior that could just lead us into a third wave, a fourth wave, and really until the vaccine is effective, allows us to keep being where we're at. Again, I'm a great believer to not kind of like turn our backs on what are important topics that require community conversation. And part of, I think, the role of leadership, and particularly the role of civic leaders, is to host conversations. And we do have, through COVID, the technology has been refined and refined and refined to enable us to do that very creatively. And I think that's one of the things I'd encourage leadership to think about. Take those difficult issues and don't run away from them, don't hide them, but put them in there to get people into conversation about it.
Peter, I know we're at the end, and because I've got the mic, I'm going to pause the clock and ask one more question that came through, because I think it's important. And the question, Peter, is there a role for youth in this leadership that you're talking about and moving forward in our communities?
Yeah. Is the Pope a Catholic? I think you've answered your own question, Paul. Any community that's not engaging us young people, I'd say, you know, what world are you living in? You know, young people, millennials, they bring such incredible gifts and skills, and think creatively outside the box and whatever. And if we're not engaging our young people in some of these difficult kind of like challenges and looking for creative answers, we're not tapping into one of the most creative sources within our community. So look, yeah, to me, it's a no-brainer. You know, young people have to be engaged, and as young as possible. We're starting during this time to see some wonderful stuff. There's a group called Community Minds have developed this school-based program called Community Minded Kids, and another group that we're part of called Are You Mad? ? Are you making a difference? And it's really about engaging young people in serious questions. And again, you know, local governments, what an incredible opportunity, not just to set up a youth council, you know, that's old fad stuff. Get into engaging young people as citizens. Give them tough kind of like issues to kind of like come up with answers for. Give them some budget. Bring them together to kind of like look at things. If you're into surfing the net, there's an amazing town called Maracuta in Victoria that got burnt out in the bushfires. It probably made international, where many people were forced onto the beaches and the Navy had to evacuate people and whatever. And it's amazing, in that little town, probably 2,000 people, it's actually been young people that are rebirthing the whole town. They've created this amazing centre to bring kind of like all these young people together as social entrepreneurs and beginning to think through. And that to me is just a wonderful example of how it operates in some ways. But you know what, in every community, if we're not engaging our young people, then, you know, I wonder what type of world that we actually live in. They are not the leaders of tomorrow. They need to be part of the leadership today. And if our leadership development strategies hasn't got a major focus on that, then I think we are putting our money into the wrong boxes. It's absolutely vital.
Well, Peter, thank you. Thank you so much. I look forward to a beer with you next time we're face to face, but I do so much appreciate you coming to Northern Ontario all the way from Australia today. Yeah. I know it's getting late, so we're going to sign off because I'm mindful of that. I could talk to you all day, but thank you so much from all this group. I know they really appreciate it, as do I. Be safe. Thank you, my friend. We'll be in touch soon. Everybody remember, October 23rd, put it on your calendars. Be there. Going to have Peter and George Cuff. You can't get better than that. Have a great evening, Peter. Have a great day, everyone else. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks, Paul, and keep inspiring. Stay safe, everyone. Go well.
Take care, Peter. Bye-bye.